In 1945, the world emerged from 6 years of devastating conflict. European cities lay in ruins. The Asian continent was bleeding. And humanity found itself confronting, for the very first time, the destructive power of a nuclear weapon. More than 70 million people had lost their lives. Entire nations had been redrawn on the map, and the world order, as it had existed before 1939, would never be the same again. World War II was, without question, the most transformative event of the 20th century. And to understand the world we live in today, its borders, its institutions, its tensions, it is essential to understand how this conflict erupted, how it unfolded, and what its consequences were. In this video, we will trace the full history of World War II, from its deep-rooted causes, buried in the rubble of the First World War, to the final moments that sealed the fate of the conflict. You will understand who the key players were, what the decisive battles were, and why this period still matters so much to us today. Stay until the end. Because this is a story every citizen of the world needs to know. To understand World War II, we must go back to the year 1919. That year, the victorious powers of the First World War gathered in Paris to define the terms of peace. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, a document that, in the eyes of many historians, planted the seeds of the next conflict. Germany was declared solely responsible for the war. As punishment, it was forced to surrender significant territories, dismantle nearly all of its armed forces, and above all, pay colossal reparations to the victorious nations. The sum was unpayable, and the country knew it. The result was a humiliated, impoverished, and resentful Germany. A country that had been sentenced to a punitive peace, a peace designed to perpetuate misery, not to foster reconciliation. In the 1920s, a devastating economic crisis swept the Western world. The Great Depression, triggered by the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange in 1929, threw millions of workers into unemployment and wiped out the savings of entire families. In already fragile countries like Germany and Italy, popular despair became fertile ground for extremist ideologies. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, rose to power in 1933. Hitler promised to restore German greatness, reverse the humiliations of Versailles, and build a vast Germanic empire. His rhetoric was inflammatory, his methods authoritarian, and his ideology deeply racist. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already been governing since 1922, leading the fascist movement, a nationalist and totalitarian regime that saw territorial expansion as the path to national greatness. In the East, the Japanese Empire, dominated by an ultranationalist military oligarchy, sought to build a sphere of influence across all of Asia and the Pacific, having already invaded Manchuria in China in 1931. Faced with this growing threat, the Western democracies, particularly Great Britain and France, adopted a policy known as appeasement. The logic was simple, if deeply misguided. Conceding to Hitler's demands would prevent another devastating war. The high point of this policy was the Munich Agreement of September 1938, in which Britain and France agreed to hand over the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London proclaiming peace for our time. That peace would last less than a year. In the early hours of September 1, 1939, the armed forces of Nazi Germany crossed the Polish border without a formal declaration of war. It was the beginning of the operation Hitler called Case White. Poland was attacked simultaneously by land, air, and sea. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, bombed Polish cities and infrastructure. The panzer divisions, armored tank units, advanced at a speed never before seen in modern warfare. This was the so-called Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. 2 days later, on September the 3rd, 1939, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had formally begun. Polish resistance was heroic but hopeless. On September the 17th, the Soviet Union, which had signed a secret non-aggression pact with Germany in August, invaded Poland from the east. Within days, the country was occupied and divided between the two totalitarian powers. In the spring of 1940, Hitler turned his attention westward. In April, German forces occupied Denmark and Norway. In May, they simultaneously invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, this time bypassing the famous Maginot Line to the north, through the Ardennes Forest, a route the Allies believed to be impenetrable. The advance was devastating. British and French forces were pushed toward the sea, trapped in the port city of Dunkirk. In a remarkable operation, more than 330,000 soldiers were evacuated across the English Channel by an improvised fleet of military and civilian vessels. It was a military defeat, but a triumph of the human spirit. On June the 22nd, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany. Paris had fallen. France was occupied. With France defeated, Great Britain stood alone in Western Europe. The new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, flatly refused any peace agreement. In a historic speech to the British Parliament, Churchill declared, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." The Battle of Britain then began, the first major aerial conflict in history. Between July and October of 1940, the Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force and pave the way for a British invasion. Outnumbered RAF pilots resisted with extraordinary courage. Hitler was forced to indefinitely postpone his invasion plans. On June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler committed what many historians consider the fatal strategic error of the war. He ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation in history, involving more than 3 million German soldiers and their allies. The initial advance was devastating. Within months, Axis forces had pushed hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, captured millions of prisoners, and approached Moscow and Leningrad. It seemed as though the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. Joseph Stalin, caught off guard by the attack despite intelligence warnings, reorganized the country for total war. Entire factories were dismantled and relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, out of German reach. The Soviet people prepared for a resistance that would be as tenacious as it was brutal. On December the 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, 2,403 Americans were dead, 19 ships had been sunk or damaged, and nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan, calling the day of the attack a date which will live in infamy. 4 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. With that decision, Hitler transformed a European conflict into a truly global war. And in doing so, he aligned against himself the greatest industrial power on the planet. On the Eastern Front, the summer of 1942 brought a new German advance toward southern Soviet territory. The objective was the city of Stalingrad, a strategic industrial center on the banks of the Volga River and, symbolically, the city bearing the Soviet leader's name. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest in the history of humanity. For months, Germans and Soviets fought street by street, building by building, floor by floor. The city was almost entirely destroyed. And yet, the Soviet defenders did not retreat. In November of 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that encircled the German Sixth Army. 330,000 German soldiers were trapped in temperatures of minus 40 degrees. In February of 1943, General Paulus surrendered with the 91,000 men who had survived. Stalingrad was a turning point. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. Strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed decisively to the Soviet Union. While the war ravaged Europe, the Pacific Theater followed its own course. In June of 1942, the Battle of Midway destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and reversed the naval balance in the ocean. The United States adopted the island-hopping strategy, leaping from island to island, cutting off Japanese bases and advancing steadily toward the Japanese archipelago. And while armies clashed on the battlefield, an unprecedented tragedy was unfolding in the shadows of the war. From 1941 onward, the Nazi regime was systematically implementing what it called the final solution, the total extermination of the Jewish people of Europe. Concentration and extermination camps operated as industrial machines of death. By the end of the war, approximately 6 million Jews had been murdered, 2/3 of the entire Jewish population of Europe. The Holocaust was not an event that ran parallel to the war. It was an integral part of the Nazi worldview that drove it. In July of 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. On July the 25th, the Grand Council of Fascism voted to remove Mussolini from power. His government had lasted 21 years. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious operation in history began on the shores of Normandy in northern France. Operation Overlord, known forever as D-Day, involved more than 156,000 Allied soldiers, 5,000 vessels, and 13,000 aircraft. The landings on the 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were brutal. At Omaha, American casualties were devastating. Soldiers died before even reaching the shore, cut down by German machine guns positioned on the heights above. And still, the Allies pushed forward. By the end of the day, the beachhead was established. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. In the months that followed, Allied forces advanced through France. Paris was liberated in August of 1944. In December of 1944, Hitler launched one last desperate offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, but it was repelled after weeks of fierce fighting. In the east, the Red Army advanced with unstoppable force. By April of 1945, Berlin was surrounded. Adolf Hitler, sheltering in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, refused to surrender. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops just blocks away, Hitler took his own life. On May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, Japan continued to resist. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion destroyed the city center and killed between 70 and 80,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more died in the weeks that followed from radiation exposure. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945. World War II was over. World War II was the deadliest conflict in the history of humanity. It is estimated that between 70 and 85 million people lost their lives, roughly 3% of the entire world population at the time. The majority of the victims were civilians. Entire cities were destroyed. Warsaw, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Leningrad. Each of these cities carries the scars of a war that spared no border, no age group, no social class. From the ruins of the war, a new world order emerged. In 1945, the Allied powers founded the United Nations, with the aim of creating a diplomatic forum capable of preventing future conflicts and promoting international cooperation. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, was a direct response to the horrors perpetrated during the war. But the Allied victory did not bring a simple peace. The world quickly divided into two blocks: the Western Bloc, led by the United States, and the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union. The Cold War had begun, a geopolitical tension that would last 4 decades and shape the modern world. World War II is not merely distant history. It is a mirror. It shows us what happens when hatred and intolerance are elevated to state policy. It shows us what happens when democracies hesitate in the face of tyranny. And it shows us, too, the extraordinary capacity of human beings to resist, to rebuild, and to create, even in the midst of absolute chaos. Studying this period is an act of civic responsibility, because understanding the past is the only way to make better choices in the present. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If this content was valuable to you, please leave a like. It truly helps the channel grow and keep producing quality history content. And if you are not subscribed yet, click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next videos. In the next episode, we will dive deep into the Cold War, the silent confrontation that divided the world in two for nearly half a century. See you then.